Here. So I'm going to turn off the lights just because it's used to the PowerPoint, but there will come a time when I'll turn them back on because we're going to do some reading. So yes, I'm Brother John, and for about a year now, I have just been nuts for the faith and science topics. Evolution, Big Bang, the whole works. And so yes, I wrote a thesis on evolution and divine causality. So in what sense can we say God is a creator if there appears to be a material explanation for the origins of human beings? Tonight I'm going to talk about a much broader issue. Just how do faith and science relate on a more general level? But after my presentation, which I hope doesn't run more than 30 minutes, I want to open it up to talk about anything within the realm of faith and science that you guys are interested in. So if evolution is of interest to you, let's talk about it. If aliens are of interest to you, don't laugh, I know they're of interest to at least one present in the room. Father Mark's awesome book on Christology has a chapter at the end about aliens. It's not a ridiculous topic. But anyway, so we can talk about that. We can talk about issues of scriptural interpretation. So probably everybody's here about how Catholics don't have a literalist reading of the Bible. But much more can be said and should be said about that. Because that's an important topic that for many people is a very difficult stumbling block. Understandably so, to the acceptance of what science has to say about the world. But that's at the end. And when we have that discussion, I hope, I'm not going to, it shouldn't be like a Ask Brother John question. I hope to kind of moderate something. But I hope that the kind of discussion we have is informed by three principles that I'll talk about in my presentation. Three principles of Catholic theology that are relevant to the discussion of faith and science, faith and reason. Okay, so without further ado, this is Faith and Science, a few notes on a wonderful relationship. If you can't see the bottom here. This picture is of the quote-unquote black eye galaxy. Black so-called because these rings of dust that orbit the center of the galaxy. I'm going to throw out a few science terms just to impress you, but I really don't know all that much. Are there any? Does anybody here work in the sciences? Does anybody teach the sciences or do research? Okay, good. At least it'll be our token sciences. So it's at least faith and one science. But the reason I chose this image is because this image was taken by a very special telescope, a telescope that Father Thomas and I will visit this summer. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope is located in Safford, Arizona, on a mountain called Mount Graham. It's part of the Mount Graham International Observatory, which hosts a lot of different groups of scientists around the world. But many Jesuits and other persons part of the Catholic Church work at this telescope. Not many people know the Vatican has a really big, expensive telescope. But it does. So, faith and science, narrowing a huge topic. We can talk about 100 different things, but I'm going to talk only about two. One, has the Catholic Church been involved in the natural sciences? And for how long? And what kind of tradition do we have of Catholics caring and doing work in the sciences? And two, what are some principles explaining the relationship between Catholic faith, theology, and the natural sciences? So if the answer number one is yes, that the Catholic Church is involved in the sciences, well then the next question is why? What is there about faith and what is there about science that leads naturally to their dialogue, to their relationship between each other? Why would a person of faith be interested in science? So those are the questions I'll seek to address. So the first question is really a very easy one. We'll spend just a couple minutes on it. I'm just going to give you a sampling of a very rich history of Catholics being involved in the sciences. These are 8 priests, many of them bishops, one a saint. But there's literally hundreds of priest scientists. Wikipedia has a list, you can check it out. I didn't count how many, but it's probably around 200, just what they have, of priest scientists. So never mind the many more laymen and women who have, over the centuries, been involved in the sciences, who were also believing Catholics, and Christians of other denominations as well. But these are some of my favorites. Albert the Great, he's very famous for having brought to the medieval universities the tradition of Greek and Arab science and philosophy. He also made a lot of independent observations about nature himself. He did a lot of classification work in botany and zoology. My favorite observation that I've read from, I've never read his works, but I read secondary stuff about him, but somebody once, so I read somewhere that he observed that ants, with their antennas removed, lose their sense of direction. So I could just imagine, you know.
We don't know where he's going.
Write it down. But that, you know, that's the kind of detailed observational work proper to the sciences. Nicholas O.Rem is I never heard of him until I started getting into this, but he's really cool. I read one work I read, it's called him the most important medieval scientist. He was a monk, and he's very important for physics, mathematics. So he musicology, psychology. He developed the use of simple graphs to plot physical quantities, anticipating Descartes' analytic geometry by a couple centuries. So, you know, the idea that we would have a graph and plot, you know, two different, so plot time and plot distance is not something we've always done. But O.Rem was one of the pioneers in that kind of work. O.Rem is also, he's very famous for having realized, centuries before Galileo, that the speed at which a body falls is proportionate to the time it has fallen. It's not known whether or not Galileo's law of falling bodies is just taken straight from O.Rem or whether he discovered it independently. But the laws are basically the same. And O.Rem came to this observation himself centuries ago, just working in his monastery with whatever the heck this sort of thing is. Nicholas of Cusa was a cardinal. He's not a scientist at all, but I include him up here because he's an extremely interesting figure. I read somewhere that he almost became pope. And this guy who almost became pope for philosophical and theological reasons, long before we ever started thinking about you know, Galileo and heliocentric universes and things like that, postulated an infinitely expanding universe and an Earth and a sun that were in motion within it, and aliens. And all of this because, for reasons of theology and philosophy, he saw it fitting that God's creativity and omnipotent power would give rise to such a universe, that he would create such a large, vast, diverse, and beautiful universe. Now this guy almost became pope. You know, and if Copernicus or Galileo were bold, and you know, by their day they were very bold, what about Cusa, aliens, and I mean, and for theological reasons, never mind reasons of natural science, that the Earth is moving. And what's important to realize is that the church tolerated, not just tolerated, it supported such a figure. He almost became pope. And so one of the unfortunate you know, things we hear a lot in our day is that the Catholic Church is antithetical to science because it doesn't like you know, any theory that appears to contradict anything it says. Well, Nicholas of Cusa is a shining example of the contrary, I think. Francesco Grimaldi is a very important figure. He observed the diffraction of light. So if you shine a light on an object and it casts a shadow, he noticed that the shaded spots have some bits of light, and the light spots have some bits of shadow. And you know, so he made a lot of detailed observations about this phenomenon. And 2 centuries later, the cause of it was realized that light's a wave, and so light does that. Blessed Nicholas of Steno is one of my favorites. He's a convert and later bishop. He has a very beautiful line. Beautiful is what we see. More beautiful is what we comprehend. Most beautiful is what we cannot comprehend. And this was a man of very deep faith, very, very, very good and important science. He's an anatomist, a paleontologist, you know, in his day. He's the reason we speak of things like Stenson's duct, or we don't speak, anatomy speaking. Stenson's duct, Stenson's gland, Stenson's vein, Stenson's foramina. Very famously, he was dissecting a great white shark. And he noticed that, a pretty cool thing to do, and he had the big old tooth. And he said, this looks a lot like the so-called tongue stones from the island of Malta. And that led him to develop a theory of fossils. Before that, it was not known that living things would die and become fossils. Things that looked like living things were called tongue stones. So, like, it's not a tooth, it's a tongue stone. It's a stone that looks like a tooth, but it's not a tooth. Shells, these were supposed to have formed spontaneously by nature, not be the remains of once living beings. Steno put 2 and 2 together. And also, over the course of his work with fossils, he became one of the fathers of modern stratigraphy. If you Google Steno's principles of stratigraphy, you'll see just how foundational his ideas are. Pietro Angelo Secchi. I've probably already said I've got a favorite already, but he's my favorite too. Because he is one of the pioneers of color classification of stars through spectroscopy. He would stand above San Ignacio Church in Rome, and by filtering the light that comes from stars through prisms, be able to classify the stars into different categories. So a star is not just a star anymore. Stars are different kinds. I don't know exactly how much he knew about what made the different kinds, whether it was something of age or what, but he began to classify them according to their patterns of light. This is still done today. This is how they tell what's in stars, how old stars are, all things like that. And it's just a beautiful image of faith and science, I think, to know that Angelo Secchi would say Mass with his brother Jesuits in the church, and then a couple hours later climb to the roof and pull out his prism and his telescope and start working. And I have a very personal connection to Angelo, which we'll see on the next slide. But Gregor Mendel, odds are you've heard of him. Father of modern genetics, right? Discovering the laws of inheritance. What people may not know is that he was an Augustinian monk, and that he did his work in his monastery garden. So his abbot had to have known about it, had to have been willing to pay for all the pea plants and all the things he did. So here's just another example of very strong institutional support by the Catholic Church for science. And George Lemaitre, which is another not well known, which is incredible. I didn't know, so I'm not putting anybody down. I didn't know until a couple months ago. Is George Lemaitre is a Belgian priest and the author of the theory of the Big Bang. I mean, did we know that? That the Big Bang was cooked up by George Lemaitre. Actually, that title, the Big Bang, was given it by one of Father Lemaitre's antagonists in the scientific community, Fred Hoyle, who did not like the idea that the universe might have had a temporal beginning, and preferred to see the universe as a steady state. So it just always was and always will be in the way that it is. And so he kind of mocked the theory by calling it, some Big Bang in the beginning, but the name stuck. Just so that in case somebody knows a lot about him, I'll just add one footnote, is that there was also a Russian mathematician who, at the same time as George Lemaitre, developed the mathematics which could show that Einstein's equations could describe an expanding universe. So Lemaitre wasn't like the only guy to do this, but he and Friedman was, I think, the guy's name. But Lemaitre is a big name you'll find. All right, why do I like Angelo Secchi? Well, a couple of weeks ago, the transit of Venus took place, and this won't happen again for, I think, until 2117. And I was on top of the monastery with my camera. I didn't have a prism or a telescope.
Did your abbot know that?
But obviously you can identify our church where Abbott was probably saying that. And, I took this picture, which I'm so proud of, because guess what that is? That's Venus. I just went as low as I could on the exposure and clicked this just before it dipped down below the horizon. And I tried several times when it was higher, the light was just too bright, and so I couldn't get it. But there I got it. And so there I was on top of my monastery doing scientific research. This involvement by the Catholic Church with science is still going. These are just three names. You could list 100 million of them, but you could list tons of them. Stephen Barr is one of my favorites. I met him this summer. He's a graduate of Princeton, and he teaches at the University of Delaware, a particle physicist. He's a part of the American Physical Society for, quote, original contributions, a fellow of the American Physical Society for original contributions to grand unified theory, CP violation, and baryogenesis. I don't know anything that means, but he wrote a really good book about faith and science. This was the first book I read, and I think it's still the best book I read, insofar as what it tries to do. But Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. There are two books which I would recommend to you if you wanted to go home and buy something. One is this book by the Pope, 4 homilies on creation, about the story in Genesis. But the other is this book, because this book gives a very good comprehensive view of arguments in defense of the faith in light of what we know from modern science. Brother Guy Consolmagno is another famous guy. He works at the Vatican Observatory. Here he is playing with the Vatican's meteorite collection. This is Father Tab Holchek. He's a well-known apologist for the church, particularly on issues of having to do with life, so abortion and euthanasia and things like that. And here he is, I think, testifying before the Massachusetts legislature. But he's also got books. He went to Yale, he went to MIT, so these guys aren't slouches. They're smart, and they're men of faith, and they're men of science. So why such support for science? Is this history of support accidental, or is there an essential connection between Catholic faith and the natural sciences? This picture is of Castel Gandolfo with, as you can see, 2 big fat telescopes on top. Before the Vatican had the observatory in Arizona, they had these telescopes here in Castel Gandolfo, which is just a couple miles outside Rome. But the light pollution started getting so bad that it was hindering good scientific work. And so they, upon the invitation of the University of Arizona, moved their main facilities to Arizona. So is there anything about faith and about science that would lead to such a really proud history that we have? 3 principles of Catholic theology are what I'm going to talk about now. For this, we'll put the light on because I have a handout. The first is the unity of truth. Faith in the unity of truth. This is a principle of Catholic theology which can help account for why they would be interested in the sciences. Thank you. So we have faith in the unity of truth. This is something maybe a little puzzling phrase initially. But we have faith in the unity of truth because we believe that God is the author of all truth. And that so truth, insofar as it has one ultimate origin, is unified. You don't have truth originating from the left and truth originating from the right, and therefore what originates from the left and what originates from the right can somehow conflict. Anything that's true comes ultimately from God as its one source. And so all truth has a unity to it. Ultimately, it's all coherent from the perspective of where it comes from its origin. This is the message of Pope Benedict's Regensburg address, where he says that God is not only love, but God is also logos, as St. John tells us in the Gospel. That is reason or word. And that God is not some absolutely unknown and irrational and completely unpredictable kind of God. That God certainly transcends the created order. And there's only a kind of analogy between creation and God's way of being. But nevertheless, God is himself logos. And he is, in some way, capable of being known by us. And this means that what he tells us through revelation and what he tells us through creation come from himself as logos, as reason. And so ultimately, all that we know about him through creation, through revelation, is coherent, is reasonable, is not in conflict with each other. So is there anybody who fancies himself a fine reader who would like to read this first quote about the faith and unity of truth? This idea that all truth is unified in God as its single source is found many places in the tradition. But here is just one place where it was expressed with a lot of authority at Vatican I's Constitution Dei Filius from 1870. Would anybody like to read? Anybody fancy himself a bad reader? All right, go ahead.
Even though faith is above reason, there can never be any real disagreement between faith and reason, since it is the same God who reveals the mysteries and infuses faith, and who has endowed the human mind with the light of reason. God cannot deny himself, nor can truth ever be in opposition to truth. The appearance of this kind of specious contradiction is chiefly due to the fact that either the dogmas of faith are not understood and explained in accordance with the mind of the church, or unsound views are mistaken for the conclusions of reason.
Excellent, thank you. So the Catholic Church walks a very fine line here between something called fideism and something called rationalism. Fideism is the idea that truth is accessible only in faith, and I make the assent of faith to some proposition regardless of its relationship with what reason tells me. So reason can't give me access to truth, only faith. Because whatever I know in faith, that's true, no matter what its relationship with reason. That's fideism. It's not what the Catholic Church teaches. But there's another side of the spectrum called rationalism, where everything that can be known about reality can be known through reason. And so any kind of revelation is superfluous. Anything any religion says that is not demonstrable by reason is unnecessary and untrue. This is also not what the Catholic Church teaches. The Catholic Church walks in the middle, saying that reality is really big, and human reason can know many things about it, but it cannot know everything. There are some things that are told to us by God, some things about reality that He reveals to us that aren't accessible by human reason climbing up on its own strength. Nevertheless, whatever God tells us through revelation, and whatever we discover through human reason, will not contradict if they're understood properly. That's, of course, where the real nut of the question. Right? All right. Now, this faith in the unity of truth leads very naturally to the second principle, love for human reason and a respect for scientific authority. If reason can tell us something true, that's awesome. And God Himself, who is the way, the truth, and the life, that means I can know something about Him by learning about what the world He has created through reason and thinking about Him through philosophy and theology. That's awesome. Well, that means if that reason can put us in touch with truth, that reason needs to be respected. And its methods of science need to be respected as well. Who would like to read from Gaudium et Spes, which is the document of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, where this point about the Church's respect for the legitimate autonomy of the sciences is affirmed, that allow reason to operate by its own methods, because what it tells us about the world is awesome, and we're interested. Would anybody like to read it? Thank you. Go ahead.
Culture, because it flows immediately from the spiritual and social character of man, has constant need of a just liberty in order to develop. It needs also the legitimate possibility of exercising its autonomy according to its own principles. It therefore rightly demands, respect, and enjoys a certain inviolability within the limits of the common good, as long, of course, as it preserves the rights of the individual and the community, whether particular or universal. This sacred synod, therefore, recalling the teaching of the First Vatican Council, declares that there are two orders of knowledge which are distinct, namely faith and reason, and that the Church does not forbid that the human arts and disciplines use their own principles and their proper method, each in its own domain. Therefore, acknowledging this just liberty, this sacred synod affirms the legitimate autonomy of human culture and especially of the sciences.
The Catholic Church loves reason because reason puts us in touch with truth. And God, again, is truth. The way, the truth, the life. God is Logos. Now, science and philosophy on themselves cannot lead us into all truth. That's the Holy Spirit, who, again, in the Gospel of John, will lead us into all truth. Because the Holy Spirit makes known to us the Word of God, the one through whom all things were made. And so it's only He who can really lead us into truth. That total perspective of the Word, the one Word that made all things, and in whom all things find their place and their coherence. That's not something we can pull up from human reason. It's something that comes down from God. All right, the third principle, these two things lead to a hope for the development of doctrine. And this is the real sticky point. Because we believe as Catholics and as Christians that God has revealed Himself to us. That He's told us very definite things about Himself. We accept those. But yet as we go through the course of history, we do our science, we do our philosophy, and sometimes we learn things through human reason that might appear, at least initially, to contradict something we've received through the deposit of faith. And this principle leads to the hope for the development of doctrine. And the development of doctrine is not the idea that what we receive from God can somehow evolve in a way that is no longer faithful to what it was originally. So that I once believed in a Holy Trinity and now I believe in a Holy Quaternity. Or that Jesus was God back in the council of, Nicaea said he was God, but today we know that God doesn't really become incarnate. So, I believe something else. So it is not in that sense. In no way does the development of doctrine imply that our faith changes in a fundamental sense. What it refers to is the way that the faith does change in its mode of expression. Because how we express our faith is largely dependent on the culture in which we're embedded. The words I know, the art that speaks to me. These things condition the way we understand our faith. And the conditions what goes on in our minds, what goes on in the words we speak. And those things do change as human beings go through the ages. And again, there's a very fine distinction. And it's something that you spend a lot of time talking about. But don't think that the development of doctrine means that our faith changes in a fundamental sense. It doesn't. We say the same creed over and over. Okay? But we do change or evolve or develop in the way we express our faith in light of our contemporary milieu. So when the ancient Hebrews wrote the book of Genesis under the inspiration of God, they had no idea about galaxies outside of our own. They didn't know about stars and other planets and things like that. And so they didn't describe the transcendence of God and His creative power in language that reflects that kind of knowledge. They described it in the language that they knew. But we in our day, we know a lot more about planets and stars and galaxies and things like that. And so when we describe God's act of creation, we describe it in terms of our modern cosmology. But none of the substance should have changed. And that's something that theologians, as they try to articulate the faith, need to watch out for. But to get to this quote, because of the Catholic Church's faith in the unity of truth and her love for human reason, there exists a real challenge for theology. Theology has the task of accounting for these insights from other disciplines, for truth known through other disciplines, and finding a way to articulate and understand the faith in a way that's both rational and faithful. And so, I have here a quote from John Paul II, which I think does a great job in describing this task. And so it's a rather long one, so the first person read only the first paragraph, and we'll do a quick comment, and then someone else read the second paragraph. Yeah, Paul Joseph, go ahead.
What then does the Church encourage in this relational unity between science and religion? First and foremost, that they should come to understand one another. For too long a time, they have been at arm's length. Theology has been defined as an effort of faith to achieve understanding, as fides quaerens intellectum. As such, it must be in vital interchange today with science, just as it always has been with philosophy and other forms of learning. Theology will have to call on the findings of science, and to one degree or another, as it pursues its primary concern for the human person, the reaches of freedom, the possibilities of Christian community, the nature of belief, and the intelligibility of nature and history. The vitality and significance of theology for humanity will, in a profound way, be reflected in its ability to incorporate these findings.
Okay, stop there for a minute. I love that line. Theology has been defined as an effort of faith to achieve understanding, as fides quaerens intellectum. As such, it must be in vital interchange today with science, just as it always has been with philosophy and other forms of learning. Our faith is not something God tells us about Himself that, okay, that's nice, we'll go on and do our day. We're very interested in this. Who are you, God? What is this world you've made? Who am I? And what do you want with me? I mean, these are topics that, people join monasteries for and spend their whole lives thinking about. And so there's a lot that can be said about these things. And because faith seeks understanding. Faith is not indifferent. It's okay, I got the rules, I'll go. And faith wants to know how all these things work together. And that means that theology must account, or do its best to account for how all these things work together, and do as best as it can in this age. But there's a very important qualification here. Theology can't chase after, in an imprudent and an impatient manner, every new idea that comes about. Because some things are said irresponsibly, or just plain wrong, or just really irrationally. Like, for example, the idea that the universe can create itself. That's a very popular idea amongst scientific atheists like Lawrence Krauss and his friend Richard Dawkins. Is that a thing that is not yet there, that does not yet exist, can be there to make itself there. This is an idea that is in very great contradiction with principle of sufficient reason and all those sorts of philosophical things that many people would argue you can't just dismiss and still be a rational human being. So we can't chase after every little thing. So in this task of faith-seeking understanding, theology being interested in incorporating the insights of science, there is an important qualification. Now, who would like to read the next paragraph from John Paul II? Go ahead, thank you.
Now, this is a point of delicate importance, and it has to be carefully qualified. Theology is not to incorporate indifferently each new philosophical or scientific theory. As these findings become part of the intellectual culture of the time, however, theologians must understand and attest their value in bringing out from Christian belief some of the possibilities which have not yet been realized. The helomorphism, or Aristotelian natural philosophy, for example, was adopted by medieval theologians to help them explore the nature of the sacraments and the hypostatic union. This does not mean the Church adjudicated the truth or falsity of the Aristotelian insight, since that is not her concern. It did mean that this was one of the rich insights offered by Greek culture, that it needed to be understood and taken seriously, and tested for its value in illuminating various areas of theology. Theologians might well ask, with respect to contemporary science, philosophy, and the other areas of human knowing, that they have accomplished this extraordinarily difficult process as well as did these medieval masters.
Okay, so the Pope here brings up an excellent example of the right way to understand the development of doctrine, I think. So we have believed, since Christ instituted the Eucharist at the Last Supper, that it is a real communication of His presence, body and soul divinity. We didn't always express that belief in the same language. And in fact, the early church did not know this language that the Pope referred to, of Aristotelian natural philosophy, hylomorphism, form and matter. If you've never heard of those terms, it's just not important. It was the way in which medieval theologians tried to understand the way in which God could be present in a host. And they used this language of philosophy, which many people still defend today as an adequate way for reason to try to understand it. But the point is that language wasn't always around. St. Augustine didn't talk about form and matter in Aristotelian natural philosophy, but St. Augustine believed in the real presence of the Eucharist. So the point is, again, is that we believe, we hold on, we remain faithful to what God has revealed. But the way in which we express, the way in which we understand our faith can change as the categories of our intellectual culture change. All right, so I'm going to try and conclude here in 5 minutes. Just 2 examples of these principles lived in the history of 2,000 years of faith-seeking understanding. First is, you might have noticed there's a conspicuous omission in my earlier narration of the history between the institution of the Catholic Church and science. The Galileo affair. A lot could be said here, but that's a whole other presentation. It's an important one that I think for people to know a little bit about, because it's been mythologized, and to the point where people say things that are just simply erroneous about it. And I'll read you one quote to show you just how complicated this affair actually was. But of course, Galileo was condemned to house arrest by the Inquisition. He did die in house arrest. He was allowed to publish further, but nevertheless, he was put under house arrest. He was punished. He was forced to retract his scientific hypotheses. But only in 1835 was his work removed from the index. And only in 1992 did a representative of the church as high as the Pope come out and say, we messed up. And rehabilitate Galileo in very strong terms. The Pope's speech, when he rehabilitates Galileo, called Galileo a more astute theologian than those members of the Inquisition who condemned him. Because Galileo was really an excellent theologian in addition to being a scientist. If you read his works, the way in which he understands the relationship between faith and science and the way to interpret Scripture is remarkably similar to many of the same principles we talk about today in theology. But nevertheless, this was said, and it's really awful. We say, pronounce, sentence, and declare that you, the above-mentioned Galileo, because of the things deduced in the trial and confessed by you as above, have rendered yourself, according to this holy office, vehemently suspected of heresy. That sounds nasty, but it's only the second level. There were three levels back at this time, so this is kind of like medium heresy. Namely, here's the heresy, oh gosh, of having held and believed a doctrine of false and contrary to the divine and holy Scripture, that the sun is the center of the world and does not move from east to west, and the earth moves and is not the center of the world. You know, like, I believe in one God, creator of heaven and earth, which by the way is at the geometric center of the cosmos. I've never read that. But these council fathers, and I don't mean to make fun of them too much, because they also had some principles that, you know, were valid from the right perspective, but they couldn't see how to mesh it all together. But just so you know how complicated this affair is, and so that you don't think that the Inquisition was operating under the principle of fideism, namely, I don't care what science says, the Bible says X. It doesn't matter what reason says. That was not the mode of operating of these fathers of the Inquisition. For one thing, the evidence of science was inconclusive, as Galileo himself acknowledges. And some of Galileo's arguments for the motion of the earth were just simply wrong. And today we might laugh at them, but you know, we should respect Galileo and realize that what we know today, you know, that can make us laugh at him, but he didn't know all we know today, so let's give him a break. But for example, the motion of the tides. That was an argument for the motion of the earth. And as the world water sloshes around as the earth moves. Today that sounds ridiculous. We know about the moon and gravity and things like that. But it sort of makes sense, right? You know, if you don't know about those things. But here's the real thing I want to make you aware of. Cardinal Bellarmine, who's also a saint, and the one who told Galileo the first time he came to Rome, stop teaching these things as if they're true. This is what he had to say. I say that if there were a true demonstration that the sun is at the center of the world, and the earth in the third heaven, and that the sun does not circle the earth, but the earth circles the sun, then one would have to proceed with great care and explain the Scriptures that appear contrary, and say rather that we do not understand them, and that which is demonstrated is false. But I will not believe that there is such a demonstration. You want to show me. And so again here, Cardinal Bellarmine says, if you've got the proof, then we've got to admit that. And admit that we have not understood these Scriptures correctly. So, even in the Galileo affair, things aren't as bad as the modern mythology tends to make them out. But let's go to something a little more happy. So, principles lived well. The Catholic response to evolution. Pius XII, in Humani Generis in 1950, says, the Church does not forbid that research and discussions take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. You can sense a very careful distinction here, right? The material origins of the human body. We believe that we're not simply a material being. We also have a spiritual soul. Now, what Pius is saying, okay, let's not talk about how material forces generate an immaterial reality like a spiritual soul. Let's just leave that off the table. Natural science comes nowhere near that. Natural science works with matter, so let's just set that aside. But please, tell us, evolutionary scientists, how matter can work and produce such living beings as complex as the hominids that preceded man. And then also John Paul II, a very famous address to the Pontifical Academy. There's a Pontifical Academy of Sciences, by the way, with 30 Nobel Prize winners and international scientists from all around. But anyway, in one of an address he made to that body in 1996, he says, it is indeed remarkable that this theory, evolution, has been progressively accepted by researchers following a series of discoveries in various fields of knowledge. The convergence, neither sought for nor fabricated, is in itself a significant argument in favor of this theory. What I'd like to point out about this quote is that the Pope here is respecting the authority of science. He's watching and looking at the way scientific evidence converges. He's not pontificating, even though he's the pontiff, about where that evidence ought to go. He's very interested. Oh, look at that. There's a convergence. That is a pretty good theory. Look at that. You know, so that's the attitude that he has there. The need for humble dialogue. This is the second to last slide. Just a word about faith and science dialogue in general. A word of humility to the scientists. There are limits to the scientific method. Self-imposed limits. If you say, I'm only going to look at material being, you're only going to find material being. If you set up a telescope, you're only going to see what you see through the telescope. And these limits of the scientific method do not coincide with the scope of the human mind and its inquiry into reality. We ask more questions than science can answer. Every scientific theory, which is in itself always provisional, must therefore remain open to the quote-unquote higher sciences, higher in the sense that they're more encompassing, in the sense that they gather the insights that come up from disciplines that are below. Not in the sense that they're inferior or something like that, like philosophers are better than scientists, but in that philosophers have to account for scientific insights in a way scientists don't have to account for philosophical insights. So that's the point. Got myself. But a word of humility also to the theologian. There is a legitimate sense in which Catholic dogma develops, always proceeding with honesty towards reason and obedience toward the magisterium, who as the supreme teaching authority of the Church remains responsible for the faith of millions of believers. We all can look forward in hope to the heavenly vision where we will finally see him as he is, the Logos, that all-encompassing word and reason, in whom all things find their place, because he's the one in whom all things were made. All right, another Hubble picture. But I hope you see that the fruits of this dialogue are abundant. And this picture, I think, is a great way to illustrate that. This is a picture of what is called the pillars of creation. Now, I love Genesis. I do like the Bible, believe me. And I read it and I love it. But I can also look at a Hubble picture and just be filled with wonder and awe at the majesty of the Creator. That this is the way he has brought about his creation. And then I can look and yes, those are the pillars of creation. This one is 7 light years tall. I mean, this is why I love the faith and science stuff. Like if I had 100 lifetimes, I'd be an paleontologist, a zoologist, a physicist. I might be a physicist twice. But because, I mean, you get to see all this marvelous beauty and order in the created world. And that is just a wonderful insight and reason to praise the Creator. And we lose that if we don't pay attention to it. If we're afraid of it. And we say, oh, I don't read that in the Bible, so get it out. We lose that ability to marvel in awe at the Creator of reality, because reality is all around us, and we can look at it through lots of different lenses. So that's my waxing eloquent about the fruits of dialogue.